Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, author Mark Dawidziak, A Mystery of Mysteries, The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe. Listen, we're talking Edgar Allan Poe. Of course it's going to be great. Mark's just one of those awesome people who it just feels good to talk to them. He seems like the type of guy that if you walked up to him and said, I want to talk about X, he'd be like, I absolutely do too. And you'd walk away just feeling like you're having a great day. I don't know how to explain it, but I don't need to explain it. You're going to listen to it now. Let me shut up and bring Mark on. And here we are with author Mark Dawidziak, A Mystery of Mysteries, The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe. Mark, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, this is a favorite topic. I love Poe, and I love talking about the book. So thank you.
Well, I think we'd be really shortchanging you if we jumped right to the book, because you have a very varied background. You've been a journalist, but I want to focus on some of the books that you've written before this just for a minute. You have a Columbo book. That was the one that really caught my eye. How did that one come about?
That's my second book. And it came about because I couldn't write the book that I set out to write. You're going to get a long answer to this one because there's not a really short answer to that, but I'll try to do this as quickly as I can. My first book was published in 1982. It was a history of a regional theater, the Barter Theater, a very important regional theater, very colorful theater. A lot of people, Gregory Peck, Patricia Neal, Ned Beatty, Ernest Borgnine got their start there. It's an amazing theater. And it's in Southwest Virginia, and that's where I was working at the time. And when that book was done and getting ready to be published in 1982, everybody kept asking me, what's your next book going to be? Which is a very flattering question because it suggests there will be another book. That's never a foregone conclusion. And I would have said, if you had asked me then, not blowing smoke, I've been perfectly sincere. I would have said, I know what my next book is going to be. I'm at work on it. It's going to be a history of a great television series, The Twilight Zone, my favorite show of all time. And why not me? Why shouldn't I be the one to write that book? And the theater that I had written about, two of the people who were at the theater had been in a Twilight Zone episodes, Claude Akins and Fritz Weaver, who I'd interviewed. And another one who was on the Twilight Zone, Donna Douglas, came to town to shoot a commercial. And I ran down to the shooting site and I interviewed her. And I thought, well, I'm going to write this book. Look, I've got 3 whole interviews done. And then I walked into a bookstore in 1982, and I had an experience that a lot of authors have over the years. There it was, Mark Scott Secree's The Twilight Zone Companion. And it was a great book. It's still a great book. I've had a chance to tell Mark what a great job he did with it. Much better than I would have done or could have done. So I couldn't even be angry at it. But being a very practical person, I immediately set my sights on another favorite show, which was Columbo. And that was published in 1989. It sort of set a pattern in my life, which was every time somebody has asked me what the next book is going to be, I've been wrong. It's easy to sort of think that you're in control of your life. And a lot of people are. Some people are the captains of their ship and they can chart a course and go exactly where they want to go. But if you make a living as a writer or an actor or an artist, you're probably not in control. You're probably following the winds that are going to blow you in different directions. And often they're the directions you were meant to be in. I was not ready to write that Twilight Zone book. 35 years later, I was, and I got my Twilight Zone book. It took me 35 years, but I finally got it. And if I hadn't have done the Columbo book, that wouldn't have happened. Because if you had asked me as I was finishing the Columbo book, which was published in 1989, Mark, what's your next book going to be? I would have said, I know what my next book's going to be because I already have a handshake deal with my publisher on this. It's going to be about Dashiell Hammett. I've got a great concept. They like the concept. They like the Columbo book. Your publisher, an option book. They like this as the option book. We're there. And then the people who owned the mysterious press, Warner Books, stepped in and said, no, you're no longer a nonfiction press. You're strictly a fiction press, and you have to get rid of all your nonfiction projects that haven't been signed. So we had agreed, but we had not signed a contract. So I was cut loose without a publisher at that point. And it was at that moment that a small publisher in New York called me and said, I love your Columbo book. And I said, well, that makes 2 of us. And he said, have you ever thought about doing a similar book on The Night Stalker, the TV series with Darren McGavin as Carl Kolchak? And I said, I love that series. I didn't know that there was a publisher crazy enough to do that book. And he said, well, I'm crazy enough to do that book. So that became the next book. Once again, I was wrong. Now, if I had done Dashiell Hammett, I probably would have been on a path of being mostly writing about mystery subjects. And you can get typecast very quickly as a writer, just as you can an actor. But what happened was I did the Night Stalker book. That led to doing a horror novel. That led to doing a book on Dracula. That led to editing 3 collections of works by Richard Matheson, who was a great contributor to the Twilight Zone and eons of credits. And all of this was pushing me back in the direction of, guess where, the Twilight Zone. And eventually Poe. So if I had not done Columbo, I would have not done Night Stalker. If I had not done Night Stalker, I would not have done the Dracula book. If I had not done the Dracula book, I probably wouldn't have had the street cred to do the Twilight Zone book finally. So you step back and you look at the pattern of your life and you go, oh, there is sort of this big circular pattern here, but I wouldn't have ever seen it. And then even the Columbo book sort of comes back into all this, because in 2019, a small publisher approached me about reprinting that book. And at the time, I said, come on, how many sales could possibly be left in this? There hasn't been an original episode in like 17 years. That book was published 30 years ago. It was a big print run. It had a hardcover and a paperback. Come on, it can't be. Well, he kept saying, this book's become rare. It's hard to find. The prices have gone up and up and up. People are paying hundreds of dollars for this book. We should get out a reasonably priced version of it. And then me being me, I started thinking about different things we could put on either side of the book, new material in the front and the back. And after a while, I had written about 10,000 new words for this new edition. And he finally had to call me and say, you've got to stop. You've got to stop right now. Because if you write one more word, you're going to throw the page count over on this book, and we're going to have to charge more, And I said, okay, I'm done. So that book was published November 30th, 2019. And the next day it was number 1 on Amazon on books on films and television. And it has not slowed down since.
We're all doing a whole bunch of guessing. I've learned that with my 4 decades on this earth. Your journalism career, you were a TV critic. I feel like that's a double-edged sword, because I know I'll finish TV shows nowadays and be like, I want to write something vicious about this and talk about how my time was wasted. But I have a feeling you need to be more professional than that when it's your job.
People always get the wrong idea of critics. I think for one thing, it's badly named. Start with the word critic. It's hard to even say that without getting a bad taste in your mouth when you say a critic. If you hear the word criticism, it implies something negative. Right away, you're starting to think about a critic as somebody who is sour, negative, always finding fault with things. And the truth is, most people who become critics do it not because they hate a form, it's because they really love it. You have to be truly in love with the form. If you're a classical music critic and you don't love classical music critic, what are you doing in there? And if you love something, you want to see it down to the highest possible standard. You want to celebrate the things. If you're a film critic, aren't you waiting for the next masterpiece to come along? You don't want to see the next iteration of Saw or Hostel. You want to see the next, this is the next Silence of the Lambs here. That you get really excited about. So I think most critics, they get it because it's a form they love, whether it's music or art or television or movies, plays, whatever. The misnomer about critics is that somehow they hate what they're doing. It's quite the opposite. You're thoroughly in love with what you're doing. And therefore, you want to celebrate this. And I've written 3 books about television series. And, there are things I love greatly. They're expressions of, my passion, my love. There's Columbo, The Twilight Zone, and The Night Stalker. That tells you a great deal about me right there.
Well, let's talk about another subject you clearly love, Edgar Allan Poe, A Mystery of Mysteries. All right, so there are a lot of Poe books. Why did you sit there and decide we need another Poe book?
Well, I didn't think we needed another traditional Poe book, I'll say that. Once again, here we are back to that first discussion with the first book. I did the Twilight Zone book for St. Martin's Press, and that was published in 2017. Now, when you do a book for a publisher, you owe them an option book. You pitch them another book, and they get to either accept it or pass it. I took time to do another book in between. I did a book on the Shawshank Redemption, which was for another publisher, which was for Lions Press. So that was published after the Twilight Zone book. But eventually I had to have a conversation with St. Martin's, an editor at St. Martin's, about, okay, what might the next book be? And we were having this conversation. I believe this was the fall of 2018. And I hit him with what I thought was, my best idea. This is a slam dunk, can't miss idea. And the only problem was it missed. It missed badly. He didn't care for it at all. I said, okay, well, he doesn't have to, Publishers are not in the charity business. They expect to make money off the books that you do. he countered with an idea that he thought would be good for me, and I didn't like his idea. It just left me cold. So I hit him with my second best idea, and he didn't like that. And back and forth we went throughout this conversation, and it finally reached the point where we go, well, I like you, you like me, we just haven't got it yet. Let's table this conversation for another day. And we were just about to get off the phone, and he said, what about Edgar Allan Poe? And I about dropped the phone. And Poe is one of my favorite authors. My wife and I have a theater company, the larger literary theater company. We have performed a 2-person collection of Poe's poetry and stories for many years. I have read Poe since childhood's hour, to borrow a phrase from his poem Alone. He's definitely in my pantheon of favorite authors, and yet I would have never put myself forward as a biographer for Poe. I don't know why, I just didn't. And maybe it's because there have been so many books written about Poe. So I said to the editor, I said, what made you say that? And he said, well, it seems like Poe checks a lot of your boxes. And I thought, how? And again, it takes somebody else to see it. I didn't see it. He said, well, you've written about heavyweight horror topics like Dracula and the Night Stalker. And Poe was the father of the modern horror story. You've written horror fiction, novel, short stories, novellas, comic book scripts. You've written about mystery top. Poe is the father of the detective story. You've written about one of the great detective characters of all time with Columbo. You spent most of your journalism career as a critic. Poe was a critic for most of his life. You've written a literary biography, and you've written a great deal about a widely recognized 19th century American author, Mark Twain. Tell me how this does not check all your boxes. And I thought, he's right. I hadn't thought about it. The only thing that it probably doesn't check is poetry. I have no talent or gift for poetry at all. I have a complete tin ear when it comes to poetry. But I had to concede his point, which was, yes, this is very much. But then it became the question of what kind of book on Poe. And it very quickly became clear he was fascinated with not just Poe's death, but the missing days before his death. And I sort of went like, whoa, 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 whoa. Tell me you are not suggesting we write a book that will definitively solve the mystery of Poe's death. So let me give you the short version of this. There was no death certificate. There was no autopsy. And even if there had been an autopsy, it would have been worthless because the art of the autopsy was still in the dark ages at that point. They would have performed it with the equivalent of butcher's instruments. There's no surviving soft tissue that can be subjected to any kind of modern forensics. There is no shortage of unreliable witness and conflicting testimony regarding Poe's life and death. This is as cold a case as you could possibly have. And there are at least 25 theories as to how he died. So I said, if this is the book you are suggesting, in other words, that kind of book that seems to arrive every 2 years that offers to definitively solve who Jack the Ripper was, and you can count on it. Here comes another one on the noon stage. This is going to be solve who Jack the Ripper is. I said, well, if that's the book you're suggesting, you better find yourself another lunatic because this one's driving away. I said, but I tell you what I will do. I am much more interested in how Poe lived than how he died. What if I wrote you a book about Poe's life through the filter of the mystery of his death? That'll be the sort of the prism that we examine him through. Because as somebody who I interviewed for the book said, most biographies start where most biographies start, when somebody is born. Inevitably with Poe, it seems to start with his death. You almost always start a conversation with Poe with his death. And I said, and that's why the subtitle is reversed. It's not the life and death of Edgar Allan Poe, it's the death and life of Edgar Allan Poe. Because it doesn't really matter ultimately how he died. The life part's more important because he has escaped. Poe says in The Pit and the Pendulum, Poe has his narrators say, all is not lost, even in the grave, all is not lost. And that's true of Poe. He emerges from the grave as the most alive American writer today around the world. And it's not even close. Maybe Mark Twain is a second to that. But I think Poe is better read.
Well, there's two things we have to do. Number one, it needs to be stated that although we are not on video right now, recording video, you look like Mark Twain. Like you got the mustache and everything. It looks fantastic. Everyone, search Mark's picture.
I can't see me, but it doesn't take much.
It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. Yeah. I mean that in an absolutely positive way. But I want to highlight about the book, which I found the fact that you weren't writing it as a biography, saying, I'm not a biographer. It makes it stronger because instead of a biography where you just read it straight through and this is what the author is telling you, you call out specific other people who love Poe who have written about him, including, I need to point out, a previous guest on this podcast, Matthew Pearl, one of our favorites.
Mm-hmm. No, Matthew was great. Matthew's fantastic.
He's fantastic, and he, like you, he just loves the subject and everything like that. But I think it makes it a different book because it's not a straight biography. You're allowing these other experts to come in and kind of guide you through it, and it just feels like a different flow to a book than if it was a straight biography.
Well, thank you for that. One of the things that I was very aware of when I started the book was that I was going to take some chances. Again, we didn't need another traditional A to Z biography of Poe. And I was certainly not going to set out to write the standard academic version of his life. There are better people for that. There better be better people for that. I set out to write a popular biography of Poe, number one. Number two, a biography which would completely shatter the myths that have surrounded him during his lifetime, and certainly from the moment that he died. One of the things I wanted to do was reclaim Poe, the real writer. Again, more interested in how he lived than how he died. I knew I was taking some chances. And one of the chances I was going to take was there's a dual timeline narrative that goes between the last few months of his life leading to his death, and then flash back to various portions of his life, telling his life story, alternating chapters when finally the two timelines meet at the end. There are some people who are just not going to like that, who are just going to go, I want it A to Z. I want a tradition. I understand that. That's your preference. But again, there are a lot of biographies out there that take that precise approach. I was determined to do something a little bit different because I think Poe calls for that. Poe himself took chances. So it was somewhat befitting of Poe to do that. And the second thing was not to pretend that I was somebody I wasn't. I'm not an academic. I'm not a college professor. I do not pretend to be. I'm a working writer. I've been a working writer for 45 years. I make my living by pushing nouns against verbs. If I do that effectively enough, the lights stay on around here. So my approach to this, and that's what Poe tried to do. Poe tried to be a working writer. He was the first American who tried to be a working writer and completely survive by writing, editing, and being a man of literature. Back in those days, almost all the famous writers of the time, they had other jobs. They were teachers, they worked at government jobs, they had different posts. So Poe was the first who actually tried to be a true man of letters when that kind of didn't exist as a job description back then. I approached this, I was 43 years a journalist, and I used the skills of a journalist. I used what I have. It's like what Stephen King said, and I use this quote in the book, but not about this. I use it about Poe being the father of the modern horror story. And at one point, Stephen King said that if you object to the type of things I write about, the type of things which might be a little horrific and a little terrifying, all I can say is it's what I have. And that's the way I feel about, when I approach this. If you do not like the fact that I know I was leading with my chin with the dual narrative and also by seeking out interviews, because who does interviews for a biography for somebody who died in 1849? There's nobody around to tell you they were true witnesses. So my witnesses became the people who have spent their lifetime studying certain aspects of Poe's life. My witnesses were forensic anthropologists and forensic pathologists. My expert was an FBI agent. People who could look at the case, look at this in a certain way. To me, I approach it as a journalist or maybe even a detective. Was, to say, okay, well, this is the case. So these are my witnesses that I'm relying on to tell me, okay, what about this particular aspect of Poe's life? Tell me about this. And I encouraged all of them not to talk like scholars or academics or professional police officers or anything like that. I encouraged them all to talk as conversationally and as candidly as possible. And out of that came gold. So my favorite things in the book are ways people put things to talk about Poe. And it was just wonderful. This is all a way to humanize Poe. All this was what I was after, was a way of trying to humanize Poe to people and say, he's not who you think he is. We have created this image of Poe, this pop culture grandfather of goth image. And if you say Edgar Allan Poe to most people, it's all right, what image did you just get? For most people, 99% of people, first off, will recognize Poe. That's fantastic. I mean, can you imagine who recognizes Herman Melville today? Who recognizes, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, all these writers who are supposed to outlive Poe and outshine his fame? We know what Poe looks like, or at least we think we do. And that's pretty amazing right there. We put Poe on T-shirts. We put him on coffee mugs. We put him on, ties and socks and lapel pins and everything you can think of. We market Poe's image. And again, only Mark Twain really is as recognizable as an American author. But Poe is trapped by stereotype. Again, I would say, now you got an image of Poe, and I've said, what does he look like? You kind of know, he's the guy with the little mustache. And, but how would you describe him to me? And everybody would say, well, I've got this image of this sickly fellow, sallow-skinned, hollow-eyed, up in a dusty attic, hunched over a manuscript with a raven perched on his shoulder, some red-eyed black cat prowling around through the attic, a bottle of cognac in easy reach, and he's spinning out these stories in this fever dream, probably fueled by drugs and alcohol. And none of that's true. None of that is who Poe was. It's not even close. He was this incredibly careful, versatile writer. He was very exacting. He was funny. Nobody thinks of Poe as funny, but he was funny. He was a very funny guy. He wrote as much humor as he did horror. We just don't read the humor today. It hasn't dated as well. But he had a great sense of humor. He was athletic. He walked everywhere. He had, for most of his life, kind of a military gait from when he was in the Army. He was not who we think he was. He was a professional writer. And was he drawn to some of those things that fueled the horror stories? Of course he was. Yes, he was drawn to the death culture that a lot of Americans was at the time. He certainly patterned himself on Lord Byron, a romantic poet who dressed in black. And, that was his hero. And he certainly heard the call of the creaking cellar door, let's say. He heard that call and he responded to it. There was something in him which he was, thank goodness, because he was better than anybody else writing that stuff. There was no shortage of people writing horror stories when Poe was writing. When Poe finally sets his sights on the horror story. The magazines are full of this stuff. And they were called the Gothic back then, but the magazines are of the very lurid stuff about, different things. And none of that stuff survives and doesn't deserve to survive. Poe was just that much better at it than anybody else. And that handful of stories that have sort of twisted his reputation and made him this kind of goth guy are also incredibly potent stories. And so fame's been a double-edged sword for Poe. On the one hand, this small group of stories has kept his fame alive. Book was when people found out I was writing a book about Edgar Allan Poe, they just light up. They just light up and say, I love Edgar Allan Poe. I've read everything he's written. And I never said it. I never ever said, but in the back of my mind, something in my brain went, really? You've read all 17 volumes of his work? Because if you did say that out loud, people, what? He said, well, you realize you're just reading that much of what he wrote. He only lived to be 40 years old. And in that time, he produced a tremendous amount of very high quality writing. And just a very small fraction of that is what we would call horror. What we would call, and even if you throw in the mystery, say, okay, well, let's take all the horror and all the mystery and all the poems that's sort of like The Raven and Annabel Lee and the bells that might fall into that category. It's still just a very small fraction of what he wrote.
So he went to my alma mater, West Point. And he did not make it for a multitude of reasons. But now, I don't know if you know the story that is usually told about.
I know the story.
Do you want to go for it? You want me to do
it? No, you go ahead. You're the West Pointer. Go ahead.
So he was bristling against discipline, which even the best of us sometimes had those days. And they were called out, and they tell you what uniform you're wearing. And they were going out to a parade that day, and they said, this is the uniform and all of that stuff. And one of the things they said was white belts, which were these belts that you wore to look all fancy and everything. And he decided to go on out to the parade field only in the white belts. So stark naked except for the white belts. And that was the final straw. So you looked into Edgar Allan Poe a lot. Can you confirm or even deny that story?
I think that's an urban legend. It's a great story. I heard that story in high school the first time. And, it's a great story. It's one of those stories which is attached to him. No, there's no evidence for it. And I don't think Poe would have done it either because, Poe did view himself as a Southern gentleman. I don't think it would have been in his nature to have done it.
And I don't know why, but I feel like it needs to be said. I feel like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is character assassinated by a lot of people. And I just, reading it especially, I'm kind of like, well, what did he do to everybody? He comes up a few times. Can you tell me a little bit about that and how he was seen as one thing and then became another to a lot of people?
And it's tough because Longfellow is a guy that people don't read anymore. They barely recognize the name. I mean, if you say to somebody, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Now, when I was growing up in the 1960s, there was a better shot that people would know some of the titles of the epic poems. But in his lifetime, and during Poe's lifetime, Longfellow was unbelievably popular. On top of everything else, everything in Longfellow's life went his way. He married well, had a wonderful family, had a lovely house. He taught, he had a teaching position. In other words, probably everything Poe thought he should have had, Longfellow had. Was there probably some jealousy against Longfellow? Yes. At the same time, Poe recognizes that Longfellow is not that good, that Longfellow's popularity is based on this kind of mass market moment, and that he's not going to survive. He's not going to live. He's not as good as Poe is. And Poe knows it. Poe is so good. He's maybe the only person in America who knows it. And he goes after Longfellow, and he accuses Longfellow of plagiarism. Now, plagiarism is not the same thing we think of today. We think of plagiarism as sort of word for word, taking something, putting your own name on it. What he meant was that he was appropriating ideas, structures, themes from various English poets. He's not wrong. Poe is actually not wrong, but it's a bit of a harsh accusation to hurl at such a beloved figure. And the other thing that makes it tough is Longfellow never shoots back. As a matter of fact, after Poe's death, somebody asked Longfellow about Poe, and he basically says, well, he was an immensely talented guy, and probably a lot of the reasons he acted the way he did was he deserved a lot more than he got. That's an amazing thing to say about somebody who attacked you. Longfellow comes off as just the total mensch in American literature. You can't help liking Longfellow. Even in retrospect, when you read about him, you just want to go, what a great guy. He sends money to Poe's mother-in-law. He comes off as this wonderful guy. But I think Poe understood something. And this was one thing that, again, not just as a poet, but also by the fact that many people are surprised to know that in his lifetime, Poe was not primarily known as a short story writer. He was not primarily known as a poet. He was primarily known as a critic, and a very tough, exacting critic of American literature, because Poe passionately believed that American literature would never grow up, be its own thing, and escape the shadow of Europe without this kind of high standards. And he pushed for that, but he pushed so hard that his nickname was the Tomahawk Man as a critic. So in his lifetime, Poe is primarily a critic. Secondarily, he's known as a poet. Third, he's known as a short story writer. In the 21st century, we have reversed that order. We know him primarily as a short story writer, secondarily as a poet, and then third, if you know it, as a critic. So Poe is looking at Longfellow not just through the lens of the poet, but also the critic. Poe's astute. Poe's judgments hold up. If Poe says something was of quality, we probably still know it and still reading it. Hawthorne, he recognizes Hawthorne, and he says, this guy's really good. And Hawthorne recognizes Poe in reverse. And if Poe went after somebody, we're probably not reading him today. His judgments are good. He was a really good critic, which is something that George Bernard Shaw understood and saw. Years later, George Bernard Shaw, Poe was one of his heroes. And Shaw was always bewildered that everybody wants to claim Poe. Everybody wants Poe on their team. Mystery writers want Poe, and they should have him. Even science fiction people say, a lot of what Poe wrote anticipated modern science fiction. He's one of us. The horror people certainly think he's one of us. Poets, one of us. The people who don't kind of claim Poe are critics, and they should, because that's what Shaw understood. He was a really, really wonderful critic. There's a reason that's why he was best known for that in his lifetime. But he understood Longfellow and the people around Longfellow. And Poe had the last laugh, by the way. He was right. Poe has outlived all of those writers who were considered the great writers of their time. And it's not close. It's not even a close contest. Poe's way out in front. And Poe is the one who constantly gets reintroduced. He is the renewable literary energy source of America, because everybody gets Poe in junior high school.
Mm-hmm.
You did, I did, everybody does. Everybody gets it, and it's a great age to get Poe. You can't do any better than that. Here you are in the 8th or ninth grade or however old you were when you first got Poe. And most people at that point, the vast majority of kids at that point, reading is a chore. You don't like to read. Reading assignments are boring. They're dull. And being, the American educational system, we always give kids the exact wrong things to read, things that will kill off any love of reading they might have ever had. We give them the worst things to just like, no, don't give them that, no. But then they get Poe. And here's Poe, and Poe is walling people up in catacombs and sticking them in torture chambers and dismembering bodies. And you're going, wow, this is reading? And what a great age to get that, to fire up your imagination. And students love getting Poe, and teachers love teaching Poe. Even the poems. I mean, like the Raven and Annabelle Lee, and they're encouraged to memorize stanzas. How many kids know, once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. How many kids have had to memorize that? And it puts Poe's voice in their heads. And years later, they'll tell you proudly, I can still do the first 2 stanzas of the Raven. Good for you, good for you. And so Poe gets constantly reintroduced in junior high school, and on into college. And that's not just true here. He is also one of the most popular American writers around the world. Poe has always exported well. He's very popular in Europe. He's very popular in Asian countries. He's very popular just about everywhere. And so I think Poe is probably the best read American writer.
Well, you know what? As you were talking about that, I was just thinking about that. In my head, I always remember The Raven being the first one. And of course, I also remember The Simpsons redoing The Raven for an episode. But as you were talking, I thought about it and I went, no. The very first one was The Telltale Heart for me. And I remember it was early. It was 6th or 7th grade. And I remember that was one of those you read it and you go, we're allowed to read this stuff?
Yep.
You bored me with everything else and then you sneak this one in. Like the dude's losing his mind. There's something's going on here. I didn't know we were allowed to learn this stuff. That was my first, I think.
By the time they get to high school, they've had The Telltale Heart. That's one that's pretty much, maybe you don't get the Cask of Amontillado or the Mask of the Red Death, but you're going to get The Telltale Heart. And yes, it's about planned murder, obsession, and possible insanity, and the dismembering of a corpse. I mean,
it's got everything.
And nobody raises an eyebrow. Nobody says like, "Oh, we shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't." It's now such a common accepted part of the curriculum that it's and it's like, well, no, he's a great American author. Yes. If you did the same thing and gave them, say, like Stephen King, so people would be up in arms. Like, you can't give him Stephen King. Well, yes, you are. You're actually already doing it, So I love that about Poe. It bothers me that I think people still recognize Mark Twain, and they certainly quote and often misquote Mark Twain, and they recognize him with the same regularity that they recognize Poe and the same universality that they recognize Poe. But I don't think they're reading Twain as much as they used to. And that doesn't give me any pleasure to say that. I mean, 5 of my books are about Mark Twain. He's dropping out of curriculum. He's had a great run. I mean, fantastic. I'm not suggesting it's over by any means, because as long as the social criticism continues to live and continue to turn to Twain for the witticisms and the insight into the American culture. But I don't think people are actually sitting down and reading the Twain's books the way they used to. And I think Poe, they still do. I think that's still there. Thank goodness.
I think it's harder, horror is easier, right? Because it's a horror that, as we've talked about, is much more accessible. You can put this in front of kids and you're getting horror without it going too far. When you were like mentioning Saws and stuff, like you're not showing that in 6th grade. And I mean, Twain, I just always think about Twain and I say, anything you read about Twain, I mean, especially the way he goes about stuff, he's still hilarious, even if you read it for the first time today. And if you keep that mustache going, I think people are still going to remember.
I try, the great thing about, I've been playing Mark Twain on stage for 44 years. I started when I was 22 years old. But the only difference is when I was 22, it took me 2 hours to look like this. And it's gone down to about 5 minutes. It's gone down to about, put on the white suit, pick up the cigar and go. Yeah, and you're right, but and I think that's one way that Twain and Poe are almost like black and white images, almost reverse negatives. Is if you look at them, you think of Poe dressing in black, and you think of Twain dressing in white, and you think of Poe. If you came down to like one thing for Poe, just one, it probably would be horror, and if you came down to one thing for Twain, it probably would be humor. And that's kind of interesting because humor and horror, they're twins. They are the two mechanisms that we use to address things we don't like to think about, things that are uncomfortable, big themes. The horror and humor will give us approaches to those things. They're always about big things, and they give us these metaphoric devices to approach very, very difficult subjects, war, death, you name it. These things can tackle those subjects, which other forms can't, and they can live. They can live for a long, long time because that metaphoric power does not go out of style. It never runs out of gas and it never runs out of style. So that's one of the reasons I think Twain and Poe have sort of continued, while others have sort of gradually dropped off the landscape. They're the two guys we can still pick out of a police lineup if we wanted to. You could put Twain up there or Poe up there and, put them right next to Ralph Waldo Emerson, and nobody's going to get Emerson, but they're still going to get Twain and Poe. I think you're right. I think, that's one thing is that there was so much more to both men than Twain's humor and Poe's horror, but they are true masters of those forms. And those two forms are very, very difficult to write.
And I mean, your thesis in this book, of course, is there's more to Poe than what you probably remember, right? That he was this mercurial person and you hit this multiple times, he could be gregarious. He could be very charming under a lot of circumstances. So the question that came out of that for me is, how many proposals do you think he made in his time? Because that dude loved proposing.
Well, after Virginia dies, he marries his 13-year-old first cousin, which is not as icky as it sounds today.
It's still not great, though.
It wasn't great back then, but there were a lot of child brides back then. And there was also a lot of marrying of first cousins. Both of those things happened. He was sensitive to it. He changed her age. He made her 17 on the wedding license. He was sensitive to it, no question. But they were also very happily married. I think Poe was searching for that family he was denied. Poe was an orphan. And then he was never truly accepted by the Allans, who did not adopt him. They made him a foster child, but never formally adopted. And then John Allan ends up disinheriting him completely. So Poe, I think, is always kind of looking for this unconditional love from a family. And he finds it in Baltimore. He finds it in the home of his aunt, who's going to become his mother-in-law. And I think that was more important to Poe than anything. And I think he was very happy. I mean, remember, his mother-in-law is with them the whole time. She's never not with them. And this is a very happy household. She approves of the marriage. This is her daughter. And the three of them are a family. And I think that is more important to Poe than anything, the word family. And when Virginia dies of tuberculosis, the last couple of years for Poe are a little nutty. I mean, this is about as nutty as it gets. And I think one of the reasons is he knows he needs that. He needs what he's lost. He needs that sense of family. Now, he still has his mother-in-law, but he wants that calming presence of a wife. And he does. He courts sometimes two women at the same time. There's a caddish nature to what Poe's doing there at the end. He's really looking, I think, for a replacement for Virginia. I think, and I mean, and I do think that the one woman that he was truly in love with, he couldn't have. She was Annie Richmond. Who was married. I think she was married. And if all things were equal and you could have said to Poe, okay, this whole playing field that you've created here, you can have one. I don't think there's any question he would have gone for Annie Richmond. I think this was the one. But she was married and obviously had great feelings for him long, long after he was dead. She was, he gave her the name Annie. It wasn't her name, and she changed her name legally.
Well, the other big question that, especially for these years, and it's kind of a bigger question about Poe that you get into, is he could also be an amazing jerk.
Oh.
Just really shoot himself in the foot and go from, just charming, everyone loves him, to, oh, people want something terrible to happen to him. And I wonder, was it the booze?
I think to just blame it on alcohol is too easy. I mean, if you want to start a fight among Poe scholars, bring up the subject of alcohol. How much did he drink? How often? It's quite a debate. Now, there's no question alcohol was a problem for it. What kind of a problem is where the debate comes in. Now, it's clear that it took almost no alcohol at all to make him roaring drunk. I think Poe was allergic to alcohol. From the first time he has any kind of dalliance with drink, which is in college when he's at the University of Virginia. I mean, every account is the same. He would charge down the drink. He wouldn't sip it. He wouldn't savor it. He'd charge it down, and he was immediately like he'd been drinking all night. So alcohol had a devastating effect on him. And then it took him days to recover. He didn't just have a hangover the next morning. He'd take to bed and he would be out of it for a couple of days after he was drinking. So alcohol had just an incredibly devastating effect on him. There's just no two ways about that. Now, I think Poe has long periods of sobriety. Well, first off, we kind of know he does because we have witnesses that say, there are these long periods where he's not drinking. And on top of everything else, he's only 40 when he dies. It's impossible to have written the amount he wrote in all those different ways and been such a careful writer during all that time and have been drinking the whole time. It's just impossible. So he probably did have these long, long periods of sobriety. But he always chooses the wrong time to drink. That's the thing about Poe. The very point where everything's going all right, where that's the time he decides to take a drink. Poe is incredibly self-destructive to the point where you want to reach through the pages of a biography and slap him and go, "Oh, come on, not now. No, you've got it."
Allergic to alcohol and success, both of them.
Well, not just alcohol, but this is the point that he takes to pick a fight. And it's always the wrong fight with somebody. This is the point where he takes to launch a feud, a literary feud that's only going to hurt him. This is the point where he does take a drink. He is incredibly self-destructive. He wrote a story called The Imp of the Perverse, which was about this need to follow an instinct or a call that's bad for you. And it's like, and Poe had the Imp of the Perverse. There's no question. Somebody asked me this a couple of weeks ago. Somebody said, if you could have dinner with either Mark Twain or Edgar Allan Poe, which one would you choose? And I said, it's not close. Twain. I'm going to have a good time. We're going to smoke a couple cigars. We're going to have some scotch, which was his favorite. We're going to tell some stories. We're going to have a good time. Poe is the very definition of high maintenance. I would have liked to have been Poe's friend, but I think he would have been a difficult friend. I think it would have been very, very tough.
I mean, it's another thing that's universal about him is that we all have that one friend where it's like, oh, man, what did you do now? Like, oh, it was going so well. Why would you throw this away? So, Mark, this is a fantastic book. I love it. But one of the things I always ask, because we started History Nerds United, because a lot of people think history, biography, this is dry stuff. This is what we're taught in school. If you have one of those people sitting in front of you and said, I don't read history, it's boring, what would you say to them when they asked, why should I read this book?
First off, I'd probably giggle a little bit because history is the best storytelling there is. I was like one credit course away from being a double major in George Washington University. I was a journalism major and I was taking as many American history courses. I didn't want to take the statistics course. I didn't see any benefit in taking a statistics course. So I said it can be a minor. I don't need it to be a double major. But American history has always been a great love, and history in general has always been a great love because it is the best storytelling there is. It's like Mark Twain once said that, fiction is at a great disadvantage to nonfiction, that fiction has to stick to probabilities. You always have to make people believe it. History doesn't. History can be as improbable as it is, and all you can keep saying, it's true. That's exactly what happened. It happened exactly this way. There's something about Poe's life, and that's why I would go back to the death again. One of the great things, and then also one of the reasons to start with how he died, is Poe dies under circumstances which reflect his two greatest literary accomplishments. And don't drive by that one too fast. Poe dies under terrible circumstances. He lingers, he's in pain, he's rambling and out of his head by most accounts, if we are to believe most of the accounts. So he dies under circumstances which would not be out of place in one of his own horror stories. He also dies leaving us a mystery, not just a mystery, but again, a double-barreled mystery. What happened in the missing days between leaving Richmond and showing up on the streets of Baltimore, and what did he die of? How did he die? So he leaves us with the father of the American detective story, leaves us with a double-barrel mystery, and he leaves us with a horror story. That's about the best literary stage exit I've ever heard of. That's about as good as it possibly gets as far as that goes. It's almost like he planned it. It's just he didn't, but good heavens, what an amazing stage exit that is. There are three great stage exits in literary history. The first is Molière, who was not only a playwright, but an actor. And Molière is dying, tuberculosis, and can barely keep from coughing. He gets through a performance. He collapses on stage of one of his own plays. They take him to the wings, they revive him, he goes back out, he finishes the performance, and then he goes home and he dies. That's about as good as you get as far as stage exits go. And then there's Twain, who correctly predicts he's going to die when Halley's Comet comes back, that he was born with Halley's Comet in the sky in 1835. He's going to die when it comes back in 1910. And he pulls it off. He does it, exactly does it. But in some way, Poe's better than the other two. Because Poe's death actually reflects how we're going to remember him, because it reflects these two great accomplishments. First, making the horror story literature. Like Ray Bradbury said, Poe was not the only guy writing horror. He was the one who took it and made literature out of it. That's right. That's it. Poe is also the father of the modern detective story. And these are the two things we primarily remember him for. And he dies under circumstances which are right there, right in sync with those two accomplishments. I don't know how you do that. I don't know how you managed to pull that off. But, he's only 40 years old. And it's weird because most writers who die in like the 40 to 45 range, and there are a lot of American writers who died in that range. F. Scott Fitzgerald was in that range. Jack London was in that range. Just a lot of wonderful writers seem to go between 40 and 45. And when they die, to this day, we think to ourselves, these are incomplete lives. My goodness, they got, what would Fitzgerald have done if he was allowed another 20 years? Poe dies at 40, and we kind of think of it as a complete life, like something went full circle there. We don't kind of think, what would Poe have written had he lived? We kind of know what he wrote, and we accept what he wrote, and we think of that as a full life and a full accomplishment in some ways, which is somewhat remarkable because he's only 40. And 40 is when a writer is supposed to enter prime time. 40 to 60 is the sweet spot. That's where you're supposed to have spent 20 years gaining the knowledge, life experience, and the writing skill to bring it all together. And from 40 to 60, you still have the concentration and the power to build on all of that. And that's when the masterpieces come. But we don't say about Poe, what would the masterpieces have been from 40 to 60? Because we have the masterpieces. We have the Telltale Heart. We have the Cask of Amontillado. We have the Raven. We have all these wonderful pieces. So there's almost this sense, as one Poe scholar said in the book, that he did what he was meant to do. For all that, I do wonder what Poe would have done. You can't help but wondering when somebody dies at 40 and has done that much, what would he have done? But you're playing with the bank's money at that point. It's all speculation. We only know what did happen.
Well, Mark, I think that's a perfect point for us to exit stage right. Thank you so much for coming on. This was so much fun.
Oh, thanks. Again, thanks for having me. It was fun.
And that's it for this episode. Mark, thank you so much for coming on. Had such a good time. A mystery of mysteries. Come on, it's Edgar Allan Poe, everybody. Go grab it. Hit us up on social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Listen to other episodes of the podcast. Tell your friends about it. Please rate us if you can. That helps a lot. 5 stars, please. Send us emails. Let us know what you like, what you don't like, what you want us to do more of. We'd love to hear from you, nerds. Until next time, stay cool.